of our both water and electrolyte balance lecture. Just as a reminder.
This program will discuss imbalances in some of the main electrolytes in the body. The electrolyte balance in the body's fluids is absolutely crucial to many body processes, and any imbalances can cause serious disorders and can even be life-threatening. As described in an earlier program, the fluids in the body are filled with dissolved salts and minerals that take on plus or minus electrical charges and are called ions, or electrolytes. The common electrolytes sodium, potassium, and calcium take on positive charges in a fluid and are called cations. And chloride, bicarbonate, and phosphate take on negative charges and are called anions. The concentrations and charges of these electrolytes have a lot to do with how fluids move through the body and how they pass through the membranes into and out of cells and blood vessels. Osmosis, diffusion, and active transport are all processes of fluid transfer through membranes that are dependent on the concentrations of electrolytes. Imbalances in electrolytes can disrupt this flow of fluids and cause many pathological conditions. The body's cells feed themselves, rid themselves of wastes, and send and receive chemical substances from all around the body. Much of this complex fluid transportation network is controlled by electrolytes and how they influence the movement of fluids through membranes. First, we will discuss sodium.
And so let's talk about electrolyte regulation. So an electrolyte balance exists when the quantities of electrolytes that the body gains equals those that are lost. So if you remember, we gain them just like we gain water, right, through food, fluids, and metabolic reactions. And so basically you have electrolyte intake that happens here. And then from here, that has to equal out, basically electrolyte output. And we lose electrolytes from perspiration, sweat, right? And you might know this if you've ever run and then you go to lick your lips, you can feel all the salt that's around that. Feces and urine. And so what do you think are important electrolytes in the body based on previous discussion? So if we're talking about intracellular fluid components, then things like potassium, phosphate, magnesium, sulfur ions, and proteins can be found in higher levels there and are important. Extracellular components are things like sodium, chloride, calcium, and bicarbonate. So these are the important electrolytes in the body. And basically how we control their intake is things like thirst and hunger mechanisms. And basically severe electrolyte deficiencies can be characterized by if you have cravings for certain substances. For instance, salt, you might start craving salty stuff. And so we have important electrolytes in our body that we've talked about previously. For instance, sodium, potassium, and calcium. And their levels are important. For instance, we talked about sodium and how they're important in impulse conduction along axons and membrane permeability. We talked about potassium and how they're important in maintaining resting potentials of nerve and cardiac muscle cells. And we've talked about how calcium is important in the release of neurotransmitters in cell neurons and, for instance, important or pivotal muscle contractions. And you can see how, if any of these are imbalanced in any way, how it's going to affect these mechanisms. So basically what we're going to do now is we're going to go through these three main electrolytes and talk about what happens when we don't have enough or we have too much. So the first thing we're going to talk about is hypernatremia. And you can remember this has to do with salt because it's short term, or his shorthand nomenclatures is there in the terms of Na. And so if we have hyper, which means high, right? This is sodium regulation where we have high sodium. And this process is basically controlled by the enzyme aldosterone. Right? And so hypernatremia is characterized by high concentrations of sodium in the extracellular matrix or fluid. It can be caused by dehydration, fever, complications of disease. A perfect one is Cushing's, which we've already talked about when we talked about the endocrine system. There's no effective way to lower high salt concentrations by the body, except increasing water. And basically, this increase in water will try and flush out the high sodium levels. So there's drugs. So what kind of drug do you think you could take that would help to flush out water as you're drinking a lot to get rid of sodium? Diuretics can do that, right? And basically, there are just certain things that can help increase sodium retention. Sorry, guys. For instance, estrogen can do it. Glucosteroids. Both of these guys are known to help increase sodium retention. And you tend to have a decrease in sodium retention in situations where you have progesterone. So this is hypernatremia. And you can see on here, it kind of gives you an idea. Hypernatremia is levels of 147 or higher. Hypo is below 135, and that's what we're going to talk about next, right? And so this kind of gives you an idea on how it can be regulated through the body, right? Hyponatremia is when you have low sodium in the body. Of course, aldosterone helps to control that as well. And so here, this can be caused by things like water intoxication, prolonged basically water and electrolyte loss, due to fever, vomiting and diarrhea, or even renal disease. Things like Addison's can cause problems. Right? This changes blood pressure and blood volume. So all of this when we're talking about hypernatremia, the low levels can be detected by macula densa cells. And those are located in the kidney. They release renin. As part of that renin-angiotensin system, that essentially will release aldosterone from the adrenal gland. This signals to the kidneys to reabsorb more sodium into the blood. And can help to basically neutralize out the issue at hand, which is low sodium levels. So that's both hyper and hyponatremia, hypo meaning less, hyper meaning more. And on here it can tell signs and symptoms, for instance, lethargy, being kind of tired, right? Headaches, confusion, apprehension, seizures, or even coma can be a problem. And these are basically serum levels less than 135, as we were looking at earlier.
Athletes, listen up. Have you ever heard of hyponatremia? It's a rare condition, but one that you need to know about. The condition involves drinking way too much water, so much water that it depletes sodium and dilutes your blood. Now the results, seizures, coma, even death. Dr. Don Wilbur, the medical director of Global Health, joins us to talk about it. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, so what is hyponatremia?
Hyponatremia, what you're talking about is salt, or sodium of salt. And it's an electrolyte. Like your blood carries lots of electrolytes. That's part of the way we function. It carries all kinds of other things, proteins, fats, blood cells to carry oxygen, and so forth. Well, the sodium is very important as far as the function of your body. And if you lower the sodium level in your blood, then things don't function well, and that's when you get into the lethargy, cramps, even seizures, and even death. So you don't want to let your sodium level drop. The way it's dropping, what we're talking about here is in athletes, is by diluting it too much. I take in too much regular water and I dilute the sodium so the sodium level drops, thus hypo. So hyponatremia is a low sodium level, and it can be very injurious. It happens in these athletes that are participating in the sports and maybe losing some electrolytes or maybe over drinking. And the other place it happens is in these contests that people have where they drink lots of water. And that can happen with them too. There've been different contests on radio stations where they drank a lot of water and people have had a bad outcome. Yes.
So that kind of gives you an idea of how hypo and hypernatremia work. Now the next is potassium. And so you can see in here, again, you can remember this one because it has a K in it. Hyper meaning high, right? Levels. And so this can be caused by renal disease, Addison's disease, or even drugs. And you can see things as having cardiac conductance issues here. It can be life-threatening, increasing potentials for VFib or even cardiac arrest, right? So having high levels of potassium can be very bad and potentially kill you. Hypocalcemia, or hypocalcemia, sorry, not calcemia, is low levels again. This can be caused by diuretic drugs, kidney disease, and an basically increase in extracellular pH. And so the body has no way of conserving potassium, so it must constantly resupply it. And the problem with this is low potassium can cause paralysis, respiratory difficulties, severe cardiac disturbances, including arrhythmias. And so making sure that your potassium levels are within range are important as well. And so when we're looking at aldosterone and how it regulates and the mechanisms behind it, basically here you can see if you have an increase in potassium concentrations with a decrease in sodium content, you are going to basically trigger on here, this way, the trigger renin release, which then will activate angiotensin 2. That is going to trigger the release of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. That will have an effect on the kidney tubules and basically increase sodium absorption, while it increases potassium secretion. And then you can get back to homeostatic levels of calcium and potassium in your blood plasma. And so that's how the aldosterone pathway works. The last one we're going to talk about here is regulation of calcium. And so we have both here, hyper and hypocalcemia. 99% of the body's calcium is in the bones through a calcium phosphate salt. Calcium, we've already talked about this, is extremely important in many biological functions in our body, such as blood clotting, cell membrane permeability, secretory activities, and the neuromuscular excitability, right? That's one of the most important that we've talked about. And so let's talk about the situations here. Hypercalcemia is basically high levels of calcium. You can see again, as always, the Ca there in the blood. And so it's controlled by parathyroid hormone. And this can be really bad because, again, it can inhibit muscle contraction. And a big muscle that would be extremely dangerous if it inhibited that would be the heart muscle, right? And so because PTH is what controls calcium levels here, it can be caused by what's known as hyperparathyroidism. Which basically causes an excess secretion of PTH, which increases bone reabsorption, and it can increase cancer. So this can be a problem. Equally, what can be a problem is hypocalcemia, which again is regulated by parathyroid hormone, and this is low levels in the blood. And so this can increase excitability in neuron signaling, to muscles. So this is what can cause muscle tetany. And remember, we need calcium to inhibit it. Not enough, you're not going to be inhibiting it. So this can be caused by reduced parathyroid hormone, vitamin D deficiencies, gastrointestinal surgeries, and excess secretion of calcium from basically kidney disease. And so how can you fix this? You can either treat by giving a large amount of calcium salts, or you can administrate high doses of vitamin D to help promote calcium absorption. And so let's look here at how the PTH regulates this. So you have hypocalcemia. This is low levels. So that's going to basically activate PHT, or parathyroid hormone, that's going to be released from the parathyroid gland, right? This does a couple things. It increases osteoclast activity, which are the chompy monsters. So that's going to release the calcium and the phosphate from that calcium phosphate salt into the bloodstream. It's going to help increase reabsorption of calcium in the kidney tubules, and it increases activation of vitamin D by calcium. What this does is, here the bones are breaking down, releasing calcium into the blood. That increases calcium, reabsorbing calcium in the tubules, and this is going to help with vitamin D to increase absorption of calcium in the foods in the small intestines. That's going to help increase calcium levels. And so when we're talking about, now that we're done talking about basically electrolytes, or very specific ions in there, how do we regulate acid-base concentrations, which essentially lead to how do we regulate pH? So when we're talking about acids, essentially what kind of acid, or acid release what kind of electrolytes? Well, if you have HCl, which we talked about earlier, it's going to release hydrogen ions. Bases release what? Hydroxide ions. And so why is it important to regulate hydrogen ions in the body? Because it changes pH. And pH changes protein structure, which will change its function. Specifically enzymatic function. The normal pH is between 7.35 to 7.45 in the body, and it's pivotal that it stays within that. And so the sources of hydrogen ions that we have come from the following. You can get carbonic acid, from aerobic respiration of glucose. Remember, it produces CO2, and then essentially CO2 combines with water to make carbonic acid. Anaerobic respiration makes lactic acid. That's why your muscles hurt. Incomplete oxidation, or think beta oxidation of fatty acids, leads to ketones. Oxidation of sulfur containing amino acids leads to sulfuric acid. And basically, the breakdown of phosphoproteins and nucleic acids lead to phosphoric acid. All of these have hydrogens, so all of them are going to increase the hydrogen concentration in the internal environment. And so for us to help regulate how much hydrogen ions are there, essentially affecting pH, we have different systems. We have what's known as the chemical buffering system. It's rapid, it's the first line defense, it's the one that's the fastest. Brainstem respiratory centers, how fast you breathe, that acts within 1 to 3 minutes of the change that's detected. And renal mechanisms, this is urination, right? This is the most potent, but it requires hours or days to actually change the effect. So when we're talking about chemical buffering system, the very first one, the one that's fast, strong acids dissociate completely in water. So something like this is a strong acid because when you put it in water, it goes into both of its ions. And that can dramatically change the pH. So those are not good for using either strong acids or strong bases, right? Here, that would be this. These are not good to be buffers because they drastically change the pH. This is donating so many hydrogens, it's going to lower pH drastically. This one can combine with a lot of hydrogens to make water. So it's going to be able to tie up all those hydrogens, thus increasing the pH. So what you want for a good buffer is something like a weak acid or weak base. They dissociate partly, and they're good at being efficient at preventing large pH changes because they basically accept hydrogens or donate them more slowly. So a good buffering system here is the bicarbonate. And that's because it doesn't completely dissociate, so it goes back and forth like this, slowly either adding a hydrogen or donating one. Or donating a hydrogen or being able to add or taking it or accepting a hydrogen slowly. So this is an excellent buffer because it can prevent alkaline conditions as well, both giving hydrogens and taking them. Bicarbonate is found in all extracellular fluid and found in the blood plasma. Right? Now you have other things, like this is a bicarbonate. And let me show you how this looks really quick before I move on, before I talk about anything else. So here, do you see dissociation is strong? This is a strong acid. All of them are here, but here it's weak because some of them have dissociated and some of them remain stable. So this is a good buffer. Just so that you can see it. So you have 3. Bicarbonate system, it's a good buffer. Like I said, where do you find this guy? All extracellular blood plasma, right? Phosphate buffer, you see it mostly in urine and the extracellular fluid. Now, proteins are amphoretic. Which just means that they can basically bind and donate hydrogens, both. For instance, if you're looking at me show you this really quick. Here. Come on. I made that too big. Hold on, let me try this again. So this is kind of what an amino acid generally looks like. And so basically what it can do is it can have positive and negative on both sides, right? Basically, what it's talking about is that it can donate, and this is not completely right, but it gets the point across. It can donate a hydrogen group here, and it can accept a hydrogen group here, right? And so that's what it means by that amphoteric. And you can find those in the plasma and intracellular fluid. Physiological buffers are those buffers that basically include respiration, breathing, and the renal system. They regulate amount of acids and bases in the body. They act more slowly than chemical buffers because chemicals are actually there happening at the time, but they have more capacity than the chemical buffer. So in here you have cell increases the production of CO2, which then CO2 reacts with water to make the carbonic acid. Carbonic acid can release the hydrogen into the plasma, and then basically that's going to activate the respiratory centers. That's going to increase your breathing rate to get rid of more CO2. And we talked about this quick in class. So that's how you can excrete extra carbon dioxide, which is causing your pH. Renal, how this works is high proteins getting taken in. They can increase the metabolism of amino acids. This increases sulfuric and phosphoric acid, which can increase hydrogen in the fluids. Increased secretion of hydrogen of the fluid in the renal tubules can be activated, and so increases the concentration of hydrogen in the urine, which means the concentration of hydrogen in the body returns normal because you're getting rid of it through your kidneys. And then basically you have alkalosis and acidosis here. And alkalosis, acidosis are conditions. Acidosis is whenever you get an accumulation of acid in the body, and then essentially it's going to make the pH go acidic. Alkalosis is the opposite. You don't have as much hydrogens. You have more molecules that are accepting hydrogen, so the pH goes up. And so in this example, the top part of this is acidosis. This is accumulation of acids, losses of base. That's going to increase the hydrogen concentration, pH drops, acidosis. Loss of acid, accumulation of base, decreases the amount of hydrogen, pH rises, alkalosis. Respiratory and metabolic come from the idea of where are they starting. Respiratory acidosis or alkalosis starts with breathing. So basically your breathing is changing, causing the acidosis or alkalosis. So that's when it's going to be respiratory. Metabolic is coming from what's happening in your body. Your breathing can change because it's a physiological buffer system. But the initiation of the pH change comes from the metabolism in the body. And there's kind of a handout that can help you with that. And so acidosis, respiratory acidosis, is from a decrease in ventilation or hypoventilation. That's going to increase the concentration of carbon dioxide in the blood, and it decreases the pH system. So if you're not breathing as much, not as much CO2 comes out, pH gets lower. Alkalosis is the opposite. So respiratory is happening due to your breathing. Metabolic is coming from something happening in your body. So here, the kidneys are not removing enough acid from the body. So how will your body compensate? It leads to you breathing faster to try to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the body to diminish the change in pH, right? And alkalosis can come with an increase in bicarbonate concentrations. This occurs as a consequence of loss of hydrogen from the body or gain of this bicarbonate. And so you might breathe slower to try to keep CO2 in the body so that your pH doesn't become too basic. So the difference in the two, remember guys, is due to the mechanisms that cause it. And so we are done with this, and that'll be it for this exam. Thanks.